Yes, welcome everybody. It is so special to have people from all around the world. I can see Chris in Australia, I can see Ronnie in Israel. Um, it's just so special to have everybody coming together for this really important conversation that we're about to have with Mag. Yeah, thank you so much, Magdalen, for coming along today as well. Of course, it's something that we've been preparing for a while, that you've been preparing for a while, and I know that this hasn't just been, just a casual presentation that you've put together. I know that it really means a lot. There's so much of yourself and your, you know, your pain as well, and your passion that has gone into what we're going to be speaking about today. So honestly, thank you so much. I'm going to give a little brief introduction. So Magdalen is a chartered counseling psychologist and currently runs Singapore's first independent practice in existential therapy, called Encompassing Therapy and Counseling. Magdalen specializes in supporting clients going through life transitions using existential psychotherapy. Her care philosophy is to empower individuals with the freedom to discover themselves so that they can become experts of their own lives. She has adapted the application of experiential therapy to different contexts, including mental health and social work environments, and she's organized several experiential and counseling workshops for various groups and organizations in Singapore. Magdalen's mission is to introduce and adapt existential therapy to the conventional collectivistic culture of Asian society and promote acceptance and adoption of this relatively new psychotherapeutic approach in the region. So without further ado, Magdalen, I welcome you very warmly to this space, and I hand the reins over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everybody. Let me share my slides. Wherever you are, good evening on my end, and good afternoon for some of you. Thanks for coming today. So my name is Magdalen, and a little bit more about myself before I move on to today's topic on decolonial existential narratives from a Southeast Asian perspective. So my own interest is actually on authenticity as an Asian, and my own doctoral research was on the lived experience of how Singaporean millennials navigate their voices in a collective society culture. So come to today's presentation to multiple, especially yours, Natalie, of the SEA conference last year on decolonizing existential philosophy. It got me really thinking about who the Asians are in this dialogue. It's very exciting and encouraging that we're encouraging more voices of people with African continent heritage, or Afrikaners, Latin Americans, even some East Asians. But it led me thinking, where were the Southeast Asians? Because back in the days, we're talking about 8 years back, when I was still doing my doctorate, up until recently, I've often only been the only Southeast Asian in my class. And I was thinking, where were the others? Where was my tribe? And another question that was constantly on my mind was, what does it mean to return to our roots? What's my roots? Now, Southeast Asia, as you're going to see later, is a constructed region. It's about East versus West. This whole idea, East versus West as an idea, is also another constructed perspective of modern colonization, which I will speak more on later as well. So we're not like all civilizations that have centuries of history. We have not produced any philosophers. So what is our contribution then to this ongoing dialogue in the existential field? The East Asians have Taoism, has Confucianism to gain inspiration from. The Southeast Asian, the South Asians have maybe vendetta. What about us in Southeast Asia? So what do I feel about, this topic then? I feel this similar feeling of being silenced amongst these discussions. For a long time, I really didn't know what I could bring to the table. I was just talking to Natalie just now. I changed this topic today 3 times, right? It was representative of the silence that I'm feeling. The silence feels like the silence that I brought into the classrooms in NSPC. This silence feels just like the one that got me thinking about what it means to be authentic when I looked at how Singaporeans navigate their voices in my research. And also possibly I feel like I picked up on, some underlying anger and rage in these dialogues on how the focus on a Eurocentric curriculum have led to an oppression of other voices. And I question too if this decolonization discourse that is happening now in this field can end up being a repeat of colonization if we insist that this is the superior option here. That in itself, is a modern legacy. And after all, my voice here today, I feel that it was given back to me through my doctorate. I'm not sure, this idea of agency, autonomy, freedom, responsibility. I'm not sure if it's something that if I continue studying in Singapore, I would learn that. So I have to say I'm thankful for my tertiary education in the UK during my doctoral years. So the question I have for myself is how can we balance the challenges and benefits of decolonization in our understanding, right? We are, well, at least I think, and Natalie, you might think so, and all of you as well. We are not canceling the Eurocentric focus in the curriculum here. We need not throw the baby out with the bathwater. But how can we navigate the complexity of existentialism beyond criticism of the Eurocentric canon? Perhaps this question is coming from my own Chinese roots of balancing the whole yin and yang. And I'm also questioning in what ways can Eurocentric existentialism still provide insights into agency and autonomy amidst the colonial influences in Southeast Asia? Right, after all, yes, colonialism have its bad effect, but hey, I can't find it in me to say that it was all bad. Recently, well, just this week, actually, I was reading a local article on the Commonwealth Games and whether it is time to phase it out because it's no longer as relevant. And a quote by Dr. Alyssa, she is a historian of West Africa and an assistant professor in one of our local universities here. What she said really resonated with me. She says, it's problematic to say colonial history was bad and therefore we erased it, she said, because then you erase also a tremendous swath of human experience. And this is what I hope to bring across today in my talk today, right? Possibly using Southeast Asia's history to show that we cannot just let it go, to decolonize just because, everybody's talking about it. So where am I here? My motivation to think about these, to think about my participation in this discourse comes really from my desire to adapt existential psychology into where I'm living in my region. I aim to introduce existential psychology to here, and I envision it. I envision Southeast Asia initiating the development of an existential philosophy that resonates with us Southeast Asians. And also, I'm curious to explore and define what it truly means for me to be a Southeast Asian, right? So as much as I would like to present all of you with new existential ideas to mull over and explore, I do not have anything to share. With the lack of written traditions, I've been struggling to think about what I can contribute to a Southeast Asian perspective of existential philosophy. In fact, I don't think we are ready as a region to introduce existential concepts that comes from us mainly, because I think what we need to do now is to start having dialogues first. And so what I hope to do today is to kickstart this dialogue by first introducing the history of Southeast Asia that is very much existential in its birth. And in the whole process, what I hope to do is also to acknowledge history's importance, to approach this whole topic with nuance and avoid dichotomies, and to caution against perpetuating coloniality and decolonization discourse. And most importantly, is to rally for more Southeast Asian dialogues. So in this presentation, I draw on a couple of things. I draw on Southeast Asian histories. I draw on my conversations with historians as well, my own research. I draw on decolonization studies, mainly by Walter McNolo and Catherine Walsh. I draw on Natalie's SEA article, Decolonizing Existential Philosophy. And it's also a lot based on my conversations with Asian colleagues, and some of them are here today. So before I talk about the history, I want to bring up one quote by Mark Young, who runs a Existential Humanistic Institute in Yunnan. And he's been doing this for many years, for about more than 10 years now. And he said this in the Global Existential Summit. A part of this dialogue about decolonization is about going back to our roots. And he said, every culture has its wisdom passed down from the ancients. Existential thinking was always here. The existential ideas have their roots everywhere. That's the nature of the existential givens. Now, as I was reading this, I was thinking, well, then, where can I go and find inspiration? Is there anyone or any events that can potentially help me? And I looked towards the whole of Asia, but realizing that there are very fundamental differences, even say for a Chinese like me. I'm Singaporean Chinese. My parents come from Hong Kong. They're East Asians. And my husband's family come from China. So we have different kinds of Chinese. And most Chinese will say that we are very different Chinese. So who do we, even for me, where do I go back to? What are my roots? What does it mean to be Chinese here? So to me, I feel that looking towards Asia is too wide. So I tried to narrow it down to just say Singapore. But the thing is, we only have 58 years of history. Who do I gain inspiration from? So now I have to widen it to Southeast Asia, right? And as I was looking into the history of Southeast Asia, I realized that Southeast Asia as a term is a constructed term that only came up after World War II. So in the next few slides, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the birth of this region. And mind you, whatever I'm going to be sharing with you is based on my own research in the last 2-3 months. This is certainly not a history lesson. I'm not a historian, but I hope to bring about an angle that we can all connect to existentially. Because as I started getting more serious about adapting existential psychology into Singapore, I noticed that I cannot do so without going into my own history, especially Southeast Asian history. And Southeast Asia is a very peculiar region. We exist because it was the external others that brought us into existence. And this region stood out like an existential project. We are a colonized region, and even the name, like I said just now, Southeast Asia, is a name given to us by the West. So what's our world like before colonization? Let's imagine what it was like in the 15th century. It was a region where it's vibrant. There is a tapestry of cultures with kingdoms ruled by the Buddhists, by Muslim, by Hindu monarchs. Right? These diverse traditions coexisted and thrived, creating this very unique blend of religious, intellectual, and cultural heritage. And it's very important here to note that there are, we are all, at that time, everybody is globally connected already. But at this time as well, the region did not see themselves as Malaysians, Indonesians, Filipinos, or even called themselves Southeast. This region had multiple centers of economic and political life. They were interconnected by trade, by migration, by intermarriages. And so people from different parts of the world traveled freely across the seas depending on the monsoon season. And during the monsoon season, they would just stay, and they would stay until, the currents or the weather allows them to continue traveling. So people in this archipelago was part of this whole international trading system, right? And again, like I said, the monsoon seasons dictated where they're going to travel, how they're going to travel, their trading routes, right? And this mobility then challenges our traditional ideas of what it means to be indigenous, right? The people in this region, Southeast Asia, even though it was never called that in the past, the people were very deeply connected to their land, yet they were always on the move. They were trading, they were intermarrying. So this fluid lifestyle created this very strong interconnected culture that embraced various influences from around the world. So our ancestors, you could say, in Southeast Asia were already global citizens in every sense of the word at that time. I think something else that's very important here to note is that it was a world of equals at that time. So up to the 17th century, nations and communities across Asia and Europe interacted as equals. They shared ideas, they shared languages, they shared belief systems, right? And sources at that time shows that we have technological parity. So even when the Europeans were traveling to India, to Southeast Asia, to China at that time, they traveled as equals because no European powers at that time had the means to dominate other societies because they were only slowly emerging from dark ages, right? So let's talk about ships. European ships, Asian ships were made of the same quality. Weaponry, they were the same quality as well, right? So we need to keep that. The Western empires, they did not have the capability to just come into other parts of to Asia or Africa and defeat these kingdoms one by one. Instead, they had to engage in trade and diplomacy on equal footing. And so let's talk about then what happened when the external arrivals showed up and how that shaped us, right? The early encounters of colonizers, when they came, it was still rather peaceful. It is the real shift only came about in the balance of power only began during Industrial Revolution in Europe. And so once that kicked in, they could get the capital and they could just, they could use the capital to boost their technological capabilities. And this led to a very huge shift from the parity that we saw in the 15th and 16th century, with Europeans gaining much more power, right? And as these power differences grew, then Asia became more fragmented and segmented. And then come 19th century, right, this region was then chopped up and separated from the rest of Asia, thanks to this new imperial language and vocabulary. And it created an imperial geography that was very foreign to us at this time, dividing the region like slicing a piece of cake. There was South Asia, there was East Asia, there was Central Asia, there was Southeast Asia. And this is where things get a bit ironic, because now we refer to ourselves, I refer to myself as Southeast Asians, but the idea of Southeast Asia was not originally ours, right? Our ancestors did not call themselves Southeast Asians. They likely saw themselves as being the center of the world. And why not? They were. If you were in China in the 15th century, that's your center of the world. If you were in India in the 15th century, that's your center. And we in maritime Southeast Asia, that's our center of the world. But now, our center got classified as Southeast of Asia, even though we never saw ourselves as Southeast of anybody. So no one refers to the Westerners as West Asians, even though, if you think about it, we share the same piece of land. it. Some historians actually say Europe is just a peninsula of anguish, reflects now the shift in power and the power differentials between the East and West. And so now, even though I use the word East and West, I'm becoming a lot clearer now with, okay, where did that term come from? Why do we have that division? What started out as a relationship of parity and equality eventually became very unequal, with the West increasingly holding the power to shape the identity of the East, right? And so let's take note that, all this geographic labeling is rooted in imperial history, and it's important to recognize this as we explore this very rich and complex history of Southeast Asia. So then, how did Southeast Asia become a social fact? This is a question that Tom Papinski, who's a professor on Southeast Asia, asked. We are not an ontological given. It's a myth to think otherwise. Southeast Asia is a discursive construct, and Southeast Asia has always been framed as Europe's constitutive other. The thing is, decolonization is over. The British have left Singapore. Most of us in Southeast Asia, all of us, in fact, we're all independent. But coloniality still exists. And I think we need to recognize that. And also what's more important here is this distinction between decolonization and decoloniality, right? There is a very big difference here, and it's important in how we use it. And this distinction has first been noted by a Peruvian sociologist called Aníbal Cuyano, and it was made popular by Walter Mignolo. And so I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about this first. By colonialism, we refer to the history of Western modern colonial expansion. But how we are speaking about decolonization of, say, academia, of, say, technology, etc., it's about decoloniality. It's not decolonization, colonialism, right? It may be a matter of semantics here, but I think it is very important to make this distinction and appreciate then who is responsible for decoloniality. What does decolonial entail then? There are four things. We talk about reemergence, about reclaiming and revitalizing indigenous knowledge systems, languages, and cultural practices that were suppressed or marginalized during the colonial era. Then there is this thing about resurgence. It complements reemergence by emphasizing the resurgence of marginalized voice and narratives in the struggle against colonial hegemony. And there is reexistence, advocating for the reclamation of autonomy and dignity in the face of coloniality. And lastly, reconstitution. And this encompasses the broader project of reconstructing knowledge systems, social structures, and cultural frameworks in ways that are decolonized and inclusive. So allow me to come back to this in a bit when we talk about the responsibility of Southeast Asia. But let me come back now to first, how I talked about how decolonization has happened in Southeast Asia, but coloniality is still very much alive and not going away anytime soon. And I'm gonna use Singapore as an example here for two good reasons. For more people to know about this place, which is a wonderful place that I call my home. But I also feel that I can only speak up for my own country in depth, and I don't want to overrepresent other Southeast Asian countries, even though I believe that my points that I'm making will stand true for other countries as well. But I think that there will be more impact if other Southeast Asians speak up for their own countries. So coloniality still very much exists in our road signs, architecture. These black and white houses are very hard to ignore. And no one here, not even myself, would dispute that Britain's legacy runs a lot deeper than just this architectural endowment. So we're talking about 2019. So this is what, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, right? We celebrated our bicentennial year. And here is a photo of Sir Stamford Raffles when he arrived to establish a trading station for the British East India Company. And the government here, which has ruled us since independence in 1965, there is no, I don't think they have any plans to take it down, you know? And it's right smack in CBD. You can see this if you're walking down Singapore River, right? So one of Singapore historian Thum Pin Chin, he says, Singapore remains fundamentally colonial in nature. While the country's physically independent decolonization of our intellectual and psychological sphere has yet to take place. This is a photo of the speaker's corner that's not far from, Raffles statue, where people can speak, they can hold exhibitions, and they can perform freely. And it's modeled after Hyde Park in London. But here's the thing. It's the only outdoor venue where citizens can express their views without a license. So basically, you can demonstrate there without getting caught. If you demonstrate elsewhere, even if you're alone, you might be caught. Well, I'm pretty sure you're gonna be caught, and you might be thrown into jail. So while it may seem like it's a space for free speech, right, it highlights this very ongoing limitation on protest and speech in Singapore. And again, the same historian says, our major political party here inherited illiberal instincts from the colonial government, framing Singapore as constantly under threat. So we need to protect ourselves, even from our very own people. And this mindset has led to this growing executive power and continued restrictions on protest and free speech. So when you come here to Singapore and you see the speaker's corner, you know that it's more than just a place for open expression. It's a reminder of how our colonial legacies still shape our country's policies and attitudes today. And then let me talk about people here into Singapore's this very complex racial landscape. So in Singapore, it's this multicultural society with a mixture of Chinese, Malays, Indians, and other ethnic groups. And the thing is, the effects of colonial rule is still very much visible in how different communities are being treated and what they experience. So colonial powers used at that time this whole idea of divide and rule tactic to keep the communities apart and incite division amongst us races, right? Because think about it, 20,000 army soldiers is not going to be able to take over the whole country, So what they try to do is to divide us, is to make us feel like we want to fight against each other. Then they can step in and allow, then they can control the region, right? And step in as mediators to exploit this internal conflicts and to say that, we are the ones who are helping you guys here to maintain a sense of harmony. But today, even after the British has left, right, Chinese Singaporeans are still the largest ethnic group, and they tend to dominate government and businesses. And Malay Singaporeans, they are the second largest, but despite being the second largest group, they still face discrimination and stereotypes that are rooted in very colonial beliefs, where they are often seen as lazy, as lacking ambition, and prone to being more poor and less successful economically. Then I wonder, who is perpetuating it? Let's talk about how we treat the migrant workers, people coming from overseas to work in Singapore, right? There is this unspoken hierarchy that differentiates between groups based on what they do and where they come from. So basically, people from Western countries who come here for work are known as expats and often enjoy higher status and privileges. In contrast, those coming from places like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, or China to do manual labor and construction work they are called migrant workers or they're called foreign workers. And you can see this hierarchy illustrated in the photos here that I've shown you. What you see here on the left, these are dormitories, and typically you'll find these dormitories on the far end of Singapore. Close to where I live, there was once this very big incident where there was a big construction work going on, and the people and the government wanted to have a dormitory nearby, and the people around the estate, which is a private estate, they complain and say, no, we cannot possibly be living with these foreign workers or migrant workers. And so if you look at this photo in the middle, right, we have these lorries that ferries these migrant workers to and fro from their dormitories to their workplace. Thing is, recently we have a law that says that, all kids have to be belted up, in a school bus. And people have been complaining, like, why do we have these laws and nothing for these migrant workers? That it's very dangerous for them to be sitting in these lorries, and there have been multiple accidents where they get flown out of these lorries because they get into an accident. And so finally, there is this photo, I just took it online, a photo of Westerners, which reflects their higher status and how we use the term expats to describe them. Again, who is perpetuating coloniality, right? Which leads me to this question that I keep asking. Really, who is perpetuating it? Is it the Westerners? Is it our colonizers? Right? I think it's very important to emphasize that I'm not proud to say it, but really it's us, the Singaporeans, who perpetuate it. And similarly, probably in other Southeast Asian nations, it's probably often the local populations themselves who maintain these systems. Take this iconic Malayan as an example. Some of you have visited Singapore. This is the Malayan. Most tourists, when they come to visit Singapore, they will be very eager to see the symbol, right? Today, it's standing against the backdrop of skyscrapers, and it symbolizes modernity and progress as we transition from a third world country to a first world country. And the Malayan is a creature with the head of a lion and the body of a fish. And it was actually the government here, the Singapore Tourism Board in 1964, they were the one who erected it, and they have no intentions of removing it. And who designed it? It was a British zoologist, Alec Fraser, who designed it. Again, this shows how the legacy of coloniality continues to shape our perceptions and identities even as we move forward. So these colonial legacies in Singapore, as a Southeast Asian, I recognize that while coloniality has left lasting challenges, it has also brought us some positive legacies. And I think I should recognize that. And, Tommy Koh, who is a Singaporean diplomat, he says, what has it left us with? What are the positive legacies? The English language, free port, free trade, open economy, good infrastructure, the rule of law, a good civil service, police force, town planning, all these things, right? And so many government leaders here, argue that British rule, for all its flaws, laid the foundation today for our city's remarkable economic success. And Lee Kuan Yew, who was our first prime minister, he said, there was no organized human society in Singapore unless a fishing village can be called a society. And I'm guessing what he's saying here is that he sees modernism, which is really the goal of capital. Colonialism is what we needed in Singapore to survive. I'm not sure if I totally, resonate with what he says, but I'm guessing this is what he is saying here in this quote. And I believe perhaps that this is true for a lot of other Southeast Asian countries as well. If I have to reflect on how being a Singaporean with its colonial history has affected me, I have to say it has had a great impact on me, with, of course, some things that can be changed, right? So then my question is, after is it possible for Southeast Asians to return to our roots prior to the arrival of Western imperialism and look for inspiration for existential thinking there? After hearing this brief history, how we have, yes, been colonized, that Southeast Asia is a discursive construct, East versus West is possibly also a myth, right? I wonder, is it possible for us to go back to our roots? What does our roots mean, right? What does it mean to decolonial in Southeast Asia? I mentioned what decoloniality involves just now with resurgence, re-existence, reconstitution. You have to remember that he wrote that Quijano wrote these 4 things for Latin America. And then I question if this applies the same to Southeast Asia, and I would challenge it, right? I'm going to come here to this page. Perhaps we can talk about reemergence. We can talk about resurgence, where we try to reclaim and revitalize indigenous knowledge systems, language, and cultural practices. Perhaps we could, in fact, I think it's important, we should allow marginalized voices and narratives to be amplified. We can encourage the agency and autonomy of oppressed communities, But with re-existence and reconstitution, I question whether we can even talk about it. Because we never existed before colonization. So what does speaking, etc., what will that look like? How practical will that be for us? And I really wonder what will that mean for myself? Because I'm speaking to you guys in English, and this is how I speak, this is how I think as well. And this is an imperial language, right? If I have to go back to my roots, means I'm gonna have to speak in Chinese. The thing is, I can't. I don't think in Chinese. I can understand, but if you ask me to think, it will be very difficult for me to think in my own mother tongue. So I'm not sure I can do that, right? So then what is the Southeast Asian existential project then? And I think I want to get inspiration from this. He sums it up very well in this quote. It is not an external other that Southeast Asia needs in order to know and define itself, but rather a recognition of others within, and the acceptance of the fact that these others are always our others, the constitutive other that makes us what we are. So applying what he said to my thoughts on what the Southeast Asian project is, if we want to bring existentialism to this region, it's not about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's about knowing that the other is always within us. Understand how we can move on then on our own terms. It's not about throwing them out. And it will not be very practical, really, to go back to what life was like in the 15th to 17th century. But really knowing our history and appreciating it, can remind us that there are counterfactual possibilities and alternatives that has once existed. If in the past, what it was like was a vibrant and complex landscape, right? And these people, our ancestors, could deal with crisis and change without necessarily adopting a zero-sum game. Perhaps then we could learn from our Asian ancestors, right? And that history has not come to us with ready-made answers, but the consolation of history is that it reminds us that if things could be different in the past, they can also be different in the future. So here, what is it that we can learn from the past? Is that history has shown us that we can embrace multiplicity. That Southeast Asia as a region up to the 16th century, before we were called Southeast Asia, right? Before the borders were tight, were drawn out, right? We were already a fluid, adaptable, and global community. Cultures and societies coexisted and negotiate their terms over time. And then we could embrace diversity as well. That Asian globalizations were possible because past Asian communities didn't focus on just purity or authenticity. They live in a time before these rigid racial theories divided us people. And then I wonder if this complex region, if fluidity still a very big part of us at this time. So then, what is beyond history? Here I'm asking for a dialogue, a dialogue among Southeast Asians, a dialogue between the East and the West, between myself now, what I'm doing today, and with all of you. I want to get into a dialogue with you, right? But I think for this dialogue to start, there are a couple of things we all need to do. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to address people who are outside of Asia first, right? How many of us see Southeast Asia as exotic, as mystical, as alluring, or as magical? That's a result of the West framing us and labeling us that way, right? And knowing and seeing the Asian other as the other was crucial to the whole colonial enterprise. The creation of Southeast Asia as a concept that happened through books written by these colonialists. They portrayed us with these essential traits and stereotypes that still linger on today. How if you look at this picture of Starbucks with, the golden turmeric latte, it's profiting off this South Asian drink by rebranding it, right? It may seem harmless, but think about the yoga studios that we go to and how we say namaste to each other. Although namaste originally it means I bow to you in Sanskrit, now it feels more like a casual greeting. And with Bali as well, it's seen as this exotic destination with retreat centers run mainly by Westerners. And another term that has always been thrown around to describe us Asians is called, we are called Orientals. I do not personally find it offensive, but it does make me feel othered to be called an Oriental, because I see it on the same level as being called exotic. Is this view of seeing us Asians as this monolithic land of mystery and strange culture, which continues to contribute to our constant status of others. So where does this term Oriental come from? It's a label imposed by colonial powers on people who lived very differently from them. It covers their way of life, from how they eat and speak to their lived experiences. And this framing was a tool for colonial capitalism and empire building, right? Edward Said describe Orientalism as a way of thinking that creates a very clear division between the Orient and the Occident. So essentially, the West saw itself as the center of progress and civilization while viewing us as exotic, primitive, and backward. And that's why we are called Orientals, is how we are being oriented. So I would say then, I'm gaining inspiration again from, different quotes and different people. And here I have Derek McKenzie, who says, the elephant in the room is still there. It's still trudging. It's just changed its form. And again, here I will also say, yeah, coloniality is still very much present in how we see each other. But there is a lot more, that we as Southeast Asians have to take responsibility for as well, right? There's so much that we can do here. One is for us to start questioning if we can take ownership of perpetuating or continuing our colonial legacies. like I mentioned, it's not always a bad thing that these colonial legacies are perpetuated, that we are still continuing our coloniality. But what I'm urging is how much responsibility are we taking for it rather than just saying we are just used to this way of being, right? So one way, I've got a couple of things that I thought that we could all start to think about, right? Number one is we can start by asking ourselves, how do we perpetuate coloniality in our own lives? As we understand the whole system of colonial power, it means examining our own local context and linking then it to the global system. So first, we can consider our place in the system of colonial power, where we have been placed and categorized, right? So I would say, know your own colonial matrix of power. Think about your position within this whole system. Consider your nationality, your religion, your language, your sexuality, your gender, your racialized ethnicity. Each of us, Southeast Asians, whether we're Southeast Asians or not, experience the whole colonial system very differently based on our very own unique backgrounds and identities. And I'm going to use myself here as an example to show you and how it may be very different for some of these Southeast Asians here. I'm going to use my name. I've been thinking about using it, but I was a bit shy to talk about it because it's a bit too personal, right? But also for a while now, I've been very intrigued by how much the name I was given from birth reveals and betrays my East Asianness and my coloniality at the same time. And this is what makes me Southeast Asian. So this is a very long name, Cheng, Ying, and Magdalen. And I would just break it down to show you where it comes from. So Cheng is my last name. It's a last name that is not common in Southeast Asia. Like I say, my parents came from Hong Kong. They migrated to Singapore 40 years back. So I'm the first generation Singaporean in my family. So it really awes me to think that if my parents did not make that decision to come to Singapore 40 years back, I may not be having this conversation with you guys today. So Cheng is a very East Asian, I would say Hong Kong surname, right? So it shows that I come from there. And Wan Ying is my Chinese first name, but the way it's being spelled is spelled in a Singaporean Chinese way. If I lived in Hong Kong, it would have been spelled in a very different way. Anne is my baptismal name, so it reveals my Christian heritage, right? My Magdalen is a Christian name, and this is how I would prefer to be known by, but it shows my colonial roots. That most of us, a lot of us here at least, not all of us, but some of, not all of us, but a lot of us have Christian names here, right? And so through my name, it shows how my Southeast Asianness is a mixed pot of heritage and culture. So being Chinese, Singaporean Chinese to be specific, we are the majority in Singapore. I enjoy privileges that probably the Indians, the Malays, and the Eurasians don't as much. And I'm very aware of that. I'm aware of my own privilege, right? As a woman here in Singapore, again, I see myself in being in a relatively more privileged place than other countries because there is a healthier level of equality in where I am. But should I be a male, maybe I might have even more privilege. Being a heterosexual in my country also gives me a certain level of privilege. With Singapore still struggling over LGBTQ rights and with our policies favoring heterosexual marriages and families, again, being a married woman gives me a considerable amount of privilege here. And then to bring my education into the picture as well, right? Having studied in Australia and the UK, I recognize my own privilege in my own country because the way I'm used to speaking English in Singapore may not sound as colloquial. I may not use Singlish in the way I speak as much. Then again, I recognize I'm often seen as someone who has been educated overseas in a Western country that people look up highly to, who has come back to Singapore. And again, this gives me a certain privilege. But the thing is, I'm very aware that if I lived in another Southeast Asian country, my privilege will be very different. Because this is an interesting thing. Aside from Singapore, Chinese as an ethnicity is actually a minority in the whole of Southeast Asia. There is still a preference over males, in many of these Southeast Asian countries because they can continue the family line. And if I was living in a different country, my experience of being a woman would be very different. And then, if I come to the UK, which I am next month, right, this multifaceted Asian identity is immediately narrowed into just an A in BAME. So my colonial matrix of power shifts depending on where I am and where I live, right? So how can we then reactivate a memory of Southeast Asia that exceeds the epistemic confines of a nation state? And can we ever hope to reconnect with pre-modern, pre-state Southeast Asia where identities were much more fluid and shared? Based on what I said just now, according to history, if we look at history, right, as compared to other parts of Asia, Southeast Asia, fine. And in that sense, it is exciting because we have then the opportunity to create, the freedom to create. And so after understanding our own colonial matrix of power, right, how can we then go on to create things, right? We lack pre-colonial philosophers or authors offering us guidance on life, right? We lack written traditions. But what we can go to, right, could be oral traditions passed down by indigenous tribes. We can draw inspiration from colloquial expressions, from folktales and legends, from traditional practices and rituals, proverbs and sayings, arts and craft, music and dance, historical events and figures, cultural festivals and celebrations, and even family and community narratives. We can all go back into these things to help us understand what we can contribute existentially in this region. So there are its challenges, but I think there is also that freedom to create. And so aside from understanding our colonial matrix of power and understanding that we can look into these things to help us understand what it means to be, what it means to exist, I think we all have to ask ourselves as well, who are we as Southeast Asians? My research is that aside from Singapore, in addition to Singapore, most of the Southeast Asian countries in secondary schools, when we're being taught history, right, we all start from the point of independence, making this their own nation state as the focus, right? So while many of us, including myself, I call myself a Southeast Asian, explaining what it means is really not easy. I can tell you what it means to be a Singaporean, and probably a Filipino can say what it means to be a Filipino, or a Malaysian, what it means to be a Malaysian. But perhaps, and I can speak for myself clearly, that I still struggle to describe what being a Southeast Asian means to me. And so I think we need to dialogue here, right? I don't think I'll continue exploring this on my own. I think these insights will only become clear through my exchanges with others who are similar to me, but are also different from me. And this ties directly into, our existential understanding of being in the world, that we have to know ourselves, or we can only know ourselves through others. And so here I really urge us Southeast Asians to start having more conversations then, amongst ourselves. It has already been happening. I think more can be, we can do a lot more. So what has been happening in Southeast Asia, right? We have been having existential conferences, between 2016 to 2021, right? Yvonne Poo, who I'm going to be talking more about later, she was the one who has been organizing these conferences, right? Where there are a lot of these Southeast Asians, a lot of Asians who come together and really understand what existential psychology and existential therapy means. What has been happening is us forming small existential communities. Here is a couple of photos that, of us. It's a group that is organized by Mark since 2016, right? I have been on a few of these retreats where we will go to different countries together. They have come to Singapore, we've been to Malaysia, we've gone to Japan together, and we'll just live together for a few days and, to talk about life. And recently, in February, this was a picture, they came to Singapore and we had a really good time together, but also understanding what it means to be Asians and talk about existential ideas that really relates to us. Earlier this month, Krish, Vincent, I know that they are here today, Creepy from India. All of us, I brought the four of us together because all four of us want to bring existential psychology into our own respective countries, Malaysia, Philippines, India. And I thought that we cannot do it on our own. We need people, to bounce off ideas. And this was a really, really great conversation. There are, Yvonne Poo, she was the one who has been organizing the existential conferences in Malaysia. So I've asked a couple of them to share with me what they think, what needs to be done in Asia, in Southeast Asia, and how they feel what's happening in the field right here. So Yvonne Poo, she said, there seems to be a reluctance to start our own thing here. We still look up to the West as pioneers. When I organized the Malaysian conferences, few were willing to participate, especially when they saw big names from the West. The infusion of Western culture sometimes makes us forget about our own traditions. In big cities like Kuala Lumpur and probably Singapore too, we're not very aware of our own ingenuity. We tend to blend in and traditions feel out of touch. But there is value in reconnecting with our roots. In KL, Kuala Lumpur, there is a rising trend of eateries offering traditional recipes. I feel there's a need to go back to our roots, to find ourselves again. And I wonder if we'll all do the same in our approach to existential psychology. Krish, who is also from Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, and he's here today, he says, Asia will have to define the phenomenology of being an Asian for themselves. Decolonization must first happen in the UK within the context of its history and its people. The UK's education system does not include the British Empire and its implications for its former colonies. The only way is to build various Southeast Asia academic institutions in Asia that work with native local philosophies and approaches in combination with Western therapeutic models that are already in operation. The cost for an individual from Southeast Asia to come to the UK to do a doctoral course is beyond reach. If Western academic institutions cannot come to Southeast Asia, must Southeast Asia continue to go to them? This is the question. In fact, Krish and I, we have been having, multiple conversations, and I have to really thank him for today's topic because it was through our conversation together that led me to knowing what I want to talk about today, which is building the foundation and understanding for us, what is the history of Southeast Asia. I'm going to do a bit of marketing here. He's going to be talking about a similar topic in the European Conference for Existential Therapy next month. He's titled Bridging the Old West and the Old East. So, if you guys are interested in continuing this dialogue, I would urge all of you to go and listen. And he's also doing his thesis in NSPC. So below here is what he is researching on, and you can reach out to him on LinkedIn. I'm just going to move on. And we have Vincent from Philippines. When I ask him, what does he think about existential psychology and therapy in Southeast Asia and where he is, he says, we are a diverse region that abounds with beautiful sources of existential thought. The challenge I see is working with these sources. I, for one, cannot begin to assume to define a Southeast Asian philosophy when I also need to explore the philosophy of my people. Southeast Asia is steeped in oral tradition, and we need to work with indigenous sources of our own respective regions and come together to make our tapestry as one. Only then can we aim to weave a cohesive perspective with what already works in the West in a way that takes our history and experience into context. My hope is for the existential approach to be more accessible to Southeast Asia because that is one of the ways to help it grow in the region. And again, he is doing his part, Vincent, to bring existential psychology into Southeast Asia. And what he is doing in his own university is to start teaching an introduction course to existential counseling and therapy, for his own people there. And lastly, Kin Ming, my fellow Singaporean friend, he's also doing his doctorate in NSPC. He says what it means to bring existential psychology to Southeast Asia, or say Singapore, is that we have a community of people dialoguing and talking about their daily lives, encounters, and an existential point of view. I've just included some, people that I feel that, they are very interested in bringing. And I think we need a lot more people than just the 5 of us, right? So I really hope that more people could reach out and we could start having dialogues. And that's also one of the reasons why I have come up with my own blog that's on my website, and you can look at it through this QR code. It's in my own way to start a conversation going. I set up this blog last year, right, with this mission that's very close to my heart, which is to promote existential approach, the existential approach, in a manner that deeply resonates with us Asians, right? So all of you, feel free to contribute anything that you have already written or you would like to write, suited for us Asians, or even talk about your own experiences, right? I think any material out there will be very useful for us here in Southeast Asia. So I would like to end off my presentation here with a reflection on Singapore from a very new and dear friend. And preparing for this talk, it has been really interesting, but it's also led me into fields that I've never really thought that I would go back into after secondary school. History and literature being one of them. And it's also led me to reach out to new people. So Rachel being one of them. I'm not sure if he's here today. He runs reflections and perspective of Singapore. And so with his consent, I'd like to share a particular reflection that he wrote. It's called Making It Up. My nation is so young, it is made up. Unlike the older civilizations, we cannot pretend we came from a golden age. We were not conquerors, alchemists, or philosophers. We came from poor migrants. We came from adventurers, wayfarers, businessmen, voyagers. We came from long chains of mobilities radiating from South China, South Asia, Nusantara, and beyond. We came from a mistake. We came from a divorce, a marriage of only 24 months. We came from being unwanted. We came from imagination and audacity, from dead ends and desperation. My nation is so young, it is made up. We had to invent a history, choose a few heroes and villains, throw together a story, so the historians and the other academics could later quibble about them. We even made some catchy songs to sing along to. Onward lah. My nation is so young, it is made up. Cobbled together from borrowed bits painted red, white, brown, yellow, a crescent, and some stars. We are so young we still remember our findings. The sharp edges haven't even been sanded down. We can still bicker about our saints and laugh at our heroes, remembering their rough edges. There are buildings and trees older than this ridiculous Singapore idea. For a long time, I wondered at how real my country was. Unlike France or China or America, our beginnings have not faded into soft gold. Not yet. It is still too clear that we are made of made up things, a conscious composite of so many traditions. The glue is barely dry, the ink is still wet, still got the paint smell. But so what? So much of our lives are also made up, improvised, and invented. How long must nationhood take? How long does longing need to be? I see now that made up things are also real. Ideas accumulate, becoming flesh, steel, revolutions, cities, nations. There was nothing organic about this nation. It was an accident, a mistake, a failure. It didn't hatch. But maybe therein lies hope too, that we may still join in the work of creating it all over again. What is so young? We're still finding out. My nation is so young, and I can still join in the slow, important work of making it up. So for me, the words that came up from his reflections are hope and optimism. The youngness of our region here, the fact that we are constructed, gives us the opportunities that we won't have otherwise. How we are situated in time and space allows us to point things out that others can't, and allow us to be aware that we can just, we can pick and choose. We are not bounded to traditions as much. And there is a certain sense of freedom here to create a new appreciation for what it means to exist. And at the same time, calling us, and calling me especially, calling us here to question then where my responsibility, where does our responsibility lie as I pick and choose to create a Southeast Asian flavor of existential psychology. So as much as I'd like to share with all of you a Southeast Asian, an existential idea of Southeast Asian origin, I don't have. But what I've done instead, and I hope that I have achieved it today, is to show that we all have our responsibilities, if we want a dialogue going. So that's it from me. If you want a dialogue, you can just scan this QR code and drop me a message. I would love to talk to anybody here and continue our dialogue here in the Q&A session.
Wow, Magdalen, thank you so much. I know that we've spoken, over the weeks about what you're going to be presenting on. And as you said at the beginning, you've changed as you've, gone through your own process and been inspired by different things. But I I don't know what I was expecting, but this is so much more than I could have ever asked for you to, share. And I'm so grateful, and I'm so glad that it's recorded so that I can go back and rewatch to digest, because you've just shared with us so many important, powerful messages. You've really illuminated to me the importance of being curious and taking that time to speak and listen, especially listen to people from other cultures, because we can't assume to know, and we do navigate the world from what we know, and that can make it very, very narrow-minded. And as you've made beautifully clear, it can be incredibly insulting and oppressive without even necessarily meaning to, because of the way that we have been socialized to think and to talk. And this is such a perfect example of why it's so important to, as what Mark Young would say, to bridge the learnings both ways. And I'm so grateful for that, for you doing that for us today. I'm not going to take up any more time wittering on. I'm so grateful for this, but I'm also so grateful for you really emphasizing the importance of communication. So let's use the last 20 minutes or so to invite anybody that would like to join in the dialogue, to come in. Please feel free to just jump in and unmute yourself. Please feel free to put your hand up and I can bring you in. Please feel free to write a comment, and we can just play it like that. So first on my screen, I can see Ronnie, which it doesn't surprise me because I thought you'd have something to say. Ronnie, welcome.
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much, Magdalen. It was a wonderful presentation. And I want to say that I'm going to say comment because although I'm living in Israel, I spent 5 years in Asia, living in Taiwan, in Japan, and a lot of time moving around Southeast Asia. So I was very interested in what you said, and it was very interesting. But I have a comment, maybe a question, and maybe a direction.
Mhm.
From my experience, and perhaps you can correct me if you think I'm wrong, one of the main divisions between existential thinking and a kind of generalized Asian thinking is the point of individualism versus collectivism. And I think
Yeah.
existential thinking is very individualist oriented. I think it would be fascinating to try to see how that motif can weave in to the work you're going to be doing in Southeast Asia, or you're already doing. Because I think those are one of the points of challenges for a lot of people around the world, and maybe perhaps in Southeast Asia as well. How does the individualist aspect of existential thinking manifest in Southeast Asia today, and how it can benefit, if at all, the lives of people living there?
That's a very good comment. And I think, in fact, that was my research. When I looked at authenticity, my own experience, how that topic even came about was, being in class, everybody just spoke their mind and I couldn't, right? And then I went home thinking, each time I came home thinking, like, what does it mean to be authentic? What does it mean to be true to ourselves? Because if it was the individualistic thinking, I can't do it in Singapore. I just can't. So that got me thinking, what does it mean to be authentic? Can even Asians be authentic in that whole, if we go with being true to ourselves? And I would say after doing my research, yes, it's more individual. Well, there is that whole idea that existential psychology is more individualistic, but this whole phenomenological aspect, us being in the world with others, I think it's something that a lot of us Asians can relate to. What does it mean to be part of a community? Even here today in this presentation, right? We may have different ideas, but it's me learning how to be part of a group, how to hear your thoughts, Ronnie. How do I reply you? And I think one of the things that came up amongst me, Krish, Vincent, and Creepy earlier this month, towards the end, we said that our starting point in Asia might be different. That in the West, the starting point might be individuality. For us, is we need to learn what it means to be an individual, then come back to the group, to the community, and say, how else can we develop, our understanding of what it means to be part of a family, part of a group together.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Can I add something? And my sense is that perhaps the fusion of the two can be where the greatest area of growth can be. Because I personally feel that Western thought, Western living is maybe too individualistic. And maybe the traditional Asian cultures are sometimes stifling and being too collectivistic. Maybe the promise of existential thinking in Southeast Asia can be the fusion where people are gaining their responsibility in a different way, and kind of the middle path, which is very much an Asian concept anyway. But I wonder if you think that could be an area of exploration and of growth with existential psychology in Southeast Asia.
Yeah. Thanks for the affirmation, Ronnie. I really appreciate it. And I guess, well, I'm gonna bring out the other voices as well, like Krish and Vincent. I'm sure you guys would agree to that, and we have talked about it. So I really appreciate what you said, Ronnie, because it's an affirmation for us as well.
Thank you. Pleasure.
I was very good. Well, first of all, Meg, good presentation. May I ask you to come out of the slide so that we can see each other a bit more bigger?
Okay. All right.
Much better. Ronnie, there's a good question, but from where I'm sitting, that is exactly what we've been discussing in the Asian group, in that saying, how does the individualistic Western characteristic will fit in the group dualistic collective ways of being under the umbrella of Asia. And that's where in Southeast Asia we are saying that Asia doesn't exist except as a construct in Asia, outside of Asia. So I can speak how part of the colonial influences from the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then lastly the British for the last few hundred years has left a sense of mismatch of everything. So clinical psychology is very much alive in Malaysia. So the four dimensions, the way I see it, is the four dimensions of a being, personal, physical, spiritual, and the social, is already an entry point of individualistic, individual inquiry by way of talking therapy. But that could be used to facilitate the issues pertaining to individual and the collective identity, which is already present in Asia. That's where the big drama you keep hearing about. My parents don't understand me because they don't speak English. They were not Western educated, but we are, etc. So that is the East and the West already in existence, playing out every day. That makes sense. But both is already there, and both has to be managed. Because I think in Malaysia, for example, we're not interested in shutting down conversations about our past histories or how to go forward. So there will be no statues and things like that being taken down, etc. It is going to be kept and then utilized for education purposes. That makes sense.
Yeah, I want to build on that idea, that this constant tension between what it means to stand up for myself, have a voice, and to be there for others. It's a constant struggle for a lot of my clients, even for myself, even in my own family. My parents have told me, like, well, you're going to have to be Chinese. You are Chinese. I understand that you have studied in the West, right? But think about what does it mean to be Chinese. So there's this struggle there. I think it's in a lot of us Asians, right? I can say more for my country. Yeah, that's why I say, I think I'll need other voices, other Asian voices to say whether it's the same for them. Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you, Magdalen. That was really, really good presentation. The subject matter is very important to me, coming from the Caribbean, being a descendant of slaves. And what you were saying, a lot of what you were saying resonated. I'm a bit stuck on what you said earlier in your presentation about not existing before the Europeans came. So for me, there was a sense, and I grew up with a sense that we were discovered. It kind of gave this idea that we did not exist before the other, if you like, the Europeans brought us into existence. And I'm just wondering what that means, really. I mean, I think it's surely we did exist. We were there. So I'm struggling really with this concept of the non-existence before. Anyway, I'll stop there. But it's an ongoing issue. Thank you.
It's ongoing for me as well. I was just talking. I was just telling Natalie before the session that after today's topic, after today's presentation, I do not know what else I can talk about because it's an ongoing research for me as well. When I said that we did not exist, I said Southeast Asia did not exist. There were other things that existed. right? There were the different communities that existed, but Southeast Asia as a term did not exist. And for myself, I've tried hard, to think about what life could be like before colonization. And I don't think I was ever taught that, right? Nobody has talked to me about it. So it's not lived in my consciousness. And that's why there is that desire now to really go back into, like what I said, like about fables and myths and colloquial expressions and indigenous sources. Like, what was it like in the past? Because now it's made me curious as well. Like, certainly, like you said, there must be something that has existed in the past, but what was that?
I agree with you. I mean, I'm doing more or less the same thing, coming back to where my ancestors, not so much Africa yet, but in the Caribbean. But I'm thinking about it in the psychological frame of the being invisible. It's being invisible by the fact that my ancestors were slaves, but so they were not seen as humans, they were seen as animals. So there's all those kinds of things that we or I have to think about, and have had to think about, and have to come from that to kind of, it's almost like dragging myself from that definition to being human.
Yeah.
So I kind of always having to ask what is it to be human?
Yeah.
And also because only white people were seen as human. So it's always a struggle. It's always a struggle to not other them. Having been othered and not to other. So that's the sort of thing I'm thinking about.
Thank you.
I'd like to share something. Thanks for your presentation. Even the topic itself, decolonization, it's quite inspiring because it's a beginning of a journey. It's a journey. Maybe I'd like to add something what Ronnie said, because I'd like to add something from a poet, a Turkish poet, Nazım Hikmet. How can we amalgamate East and West? He said, living like a tree, unique and free, like a forest in fraternity. This yearning is ours. Yeah, that's, I think, how can we amalgamate these two? Not being in the herd, not being too individualistic, but how can we amalgamate these two? And also, I inspired by Frantz Fanon a lot. I read his book after I migrated to Australia, because probably, when I was back in Turkey, we were, our minds were brainwashed with the myth of West. But when I migrated to Australia, I started to realize that people changing their names, and after I read Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Mask, I said, my God, wow. Because he talks about internalizing the oppressor. Because you see the oppressor as the human. He is the one to be. That's why, you started to be ashamed of your own past, and you try to get rid of everything from your past, erase everything to become like the oppressor. But especially after I read in conjunction with Fanon, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and also Erich Fromm, then I started to realize, how the oppressor and oppressed dichotomy. It's a dichotomy. None of them are, because being a human is not to dominate, not to be dominated. Then how can we find a place? Maybe, I'd like to add one comment by Rumi. He said, there is a garden beyond right doing and wrong doing. I'd like to meet you there. I think that's the human level, to be a human. Because if you see the world from the oppressor and oppressed, you're not a human being. You are alienated to become a human being. So that's why, how can we reclaim our humanity? That's why, your own past, your own stories, your own fables, all of them are important because these are the links. Because, I have to grow myself. I have to recreate myself from those links. Then, I'm going to become, like with maybe what you say, Southeast Asian. That's the idea. That's my flavor. That's the flavor I can give to the earth, to the humanity. That's my contribution. Thank you.
That's a beautiful contribution. I've written down some of the things that you've said.
Thank you.
It wouldn't be a true Hidayat contribution without the poem. It's so good to see you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I know that we're at time, but I also know that Ronnie cannot end this session without saying whatever you were going to say. What are you waving?
Well, I can end it, but because my friend Hidayat said something that really, inspired me something to say here, I would ask just a question. The question is, who am I beyond the labels of culture, of history, of politics? Who am I in the world? And that's a question I think that we can think about very much like what Rumi was saying. The place beyond, what it was, beyond this and that, where is that place? That's all. I just have a question.
And while you're here, Ronnie, I will end this session by saying that next month we do indeed have Ronnie speaking. So would you like to, as you're here, give a very brief summary of what you're going to be talking about, or at least your title?
Okay, I'll make it short. Yeah, thank you. I didn't expect to say anything, but I recently finished my doctoral dissertation on the topic of reflections of children of Holocaust survivors in their second half of life on their life experience. And I'll tell you in 2 sentences what that's about. I'm a second generation of a Holocaust survivor. And I think when we reach a later stage of life, there is a sense of wisdom and reflection, looking back at what was that all about? How did our history of being a child of someone who suffered through genocide, lost family, how has it impacted who I am today in the world and who I want to be? So I think that's enough for that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll start advertising that very, very shortly. But right now we're here to be listening and dialoguing about what Magdalen brought. And honestly, I'm so grateful for everybody's contributions. It's just obviously, like Mag was saying, we're just the tip of the iceberg. We don't know where this is going to go, but it's only going to go somewhere if all of us keep talking, keep thinking, keep being curious, keep this going. And so honestly, thank you so much for taking the time to be here, everyone that's live today. Thank you for everyone that decides to take the time to watch this in the future. And biggest of all, thank you so much, Magdalen. I know it's already been an emotional and long day for you too, so I hope that you have a very, very peaceful evening and allow everything to just kind of settle back in. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing this as well, and for giving me this platform to have a voice.
Yeah. Means a lot. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
you.